I'm going to show you three numbers. That's it, just three. And they reveal one of the biggest, well, failures in American energy policy. They're simple, they're stark, and they prove that a billion-dollar strategy for our energy independence is really just built on a mathematical fantasy. Okay, let's dive right in. First up, 52 million pounds. Now, that's how much uranium America needs every single year to power our 94 nuclear reactors. And look, these aren't just any power plants. We're talking about nearly 20% of all our electricity and over half of our carbon-free power. So you could think of this number as our baseline. It's the absolute minimum we gotta have.
Okay, now for number two, 750,000 pounds. So what's this? This is how much uranium the entire United States actually produced in 2024. Yeah, you don't have to be a math whiz to see the Grand Canyon-sized gap between what we need and what we actually make.
And that, of course, brings us to our final and honestly pretty shocking number, 98.6%. That is a percentage of uranium we had to import from other countries the last year just to keep the lights on. We are almost completely dependent on the rest of the world for one of our most critical energy sources.
So you're probably thinking, okay, that's really bad. But surely we have a plan to fix it, right? And you'd be right. Congress does have a plan. They're spending hundreds of millions of our tax dollars to boost domestic production. The only problem is, the math proves it just can't work. So the real question becomes, if the plan is doomed to fail, why are they even doing it? Well, to answer that, you just gotta follow the money. See, this isn't really a story about smart energy policy. Nope, it's a story about what I'd call subsidy theater, a big performance put on for lobbyists and investors, not for national security.
And here's Act 1. Back in 2020, Congress creates this $75 million strategic uranium reserve. Sounds pretty important, right? Well, all that money bought just 1 million pounds of uranium. Now remember, we need 52 million pounds a year. So this strategic reserve, it's enough to run our entire nuclear fleet for a whopping 7 days. But here's the real kicker. It wasn't even new uranium. The government spent taxpayer money on stuff that was already mined and just sitting in a warehouse. So why on earth would they pay above market prices for old inventory? Well, it probably helps if you've spent the last few years lobbying for exactly that to happen. Check this out. One company, Energy Fuels, spent about $310,000 on lobbying. Their reward, an $18.5 million government contract from that very same reserve. That is a 60 times return on their investment. You see, the policy wasn't about securing uranium. It was about securing profits. And this was the public justification. You had quotes like this one from Senator John Barrasso, all part of the push for the reserve. But if you look into the campaign finance records, it turns out the senator was the single biggest recipient of campaign donations from uranium company execs who, what a surprise, benefited directly from the very legislation he was championing. Okay, but that's just one subsidy program. What about the actual mines? You know, the ones that are supposed to be ramping up production to make America energy independent? Surely that's where the real story is, right? Well, this is where we run smack into something called the capacity illusion. The numbers you hear from the industry, from politicians, they paint this really rosy picture. But the reality on the ground? It's something else entirely. And this chart illustrates the problem perfectly. U.S. uranium facilities on paper have a combined licensed capacity to produce 14.1 million pounds a year. Now, that would be over a quarter of what we need. Not perfect, but, respectable. But in the real world, like we just saw, they produced a tiny 750,000 pounds. The gap between the promise and the actual performance is just huge. Let's just put a single stark number on it. Our entire domestic uranium industry is operating at just over 5% of its licensed potential. Think about that. Imagine a car factory that can build 1,000 cars a day, but only 53 actually roll off the assembly line. That's exactly what's happening right now in American uranium. So let's look at the best case scenario, the top producer in the entire country, a company called enCore Energy. In their best quarter last year, they managed to pull out about 227,000 pounds of uranium. That is enough to power America's whole nuclear fleet for 37 hours. Even their own super optimistic projections for 2027 would only cover maybe 3 to 4% of what the country needs. And remember, this is the company that's winning. So you have to ask, right? If they have all this licensed capacity just sitting there, why can't they just flip a switch and produce more? What's really stopping them from closing that massive gap?
The answer, unfortunately, lies in what you could call the timeline trap. The physical and especially the regulatory reality of uranium mining in the US makes scaling up quickly a complete impossibility.
So, most U.S. production uses a method called in situ recovery, or ISR. Basically, instead of digging a giant pit, it's more like gently coaxing the uranium out of the ground with liquids. But here's the thing. Each section of a mine has to be prepared, then flushed, and then restored, one at a time. It is a slow, methodical, sequential process that you just can't rush.
So, what does that slow process look like in the real world? Well, take a look at the timeline for just one project, the Dewey Burdick project in South Dakota. They first applied for their permit way back in 2012. After a decade of legal challenges, they hope to finally finish permitting by 2026 and maybe, just maybe, start construction in 2027. Think about that for a second. 15 years to get one mine going. You can't build a secure energy future on a foundation that takes longer to lay than it takes to raise a kid.
And here's the crazy part. Even if we could magically snap our fingers and solve the timeline trap, we would still run headfirst into a brick wall of unbeatable foreign math. The pure economics of global uranium production are just stacked against the US. Here is the bottom line. It costs an American company somewhere between $45 and $50 to produce 1 pound of uranium. In Kazakhstan, which by the way supplies nearly a quarter of all our imports, they can do it for 15 to 20 bucks. It's not a fair fight. Their geology, their labor costs, it gives foreign state-owned companies an advantage we just can't overcome. So let's just run the numbers on a really optimistic best-case scenario. Let's pretend that by 2028, U.S. production ramps up like crazy to 6 million pounds a year. That's an 8-fold increase from today. Well, with our demand staying steady at 52 million pounds, we would still have to import 46 million pounds. Which means, even in this wildly optimistic scenario, 88.5% of our uranium would still have to come from foreign countries. The math is just relentless. There is no plausible path to anything that even looks like independence. So we finally come to the verdict. When you put the political rhetoric, all the talk about energy independence, up against the hard numbers of production, geology, and economics, well, it's not even a contest. Let's just be really clear about what this policy actually gets done. It absolutely delivers great campaign talking points. It provides direct cash to politically connected companies. It supports their stock prices. And yeah, it delivers an incredible return on lobbying money. But what does it fail to do? It fails to deliver any meaningful production, it fails to reduce our foreign dependence, and it completely fails to provide any real measure of energy security. In the end, it's really that simple. We are spending hundreds of millions of dollars chasing a fantasy of energy independence that the numbers prove, without a doubt, is impossible. The math doesn't lie, but the policy does.